Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the Revival ATALANTE 5. This is a pretty massive stand mount type speaker, although it can be set on the floor depending on how you configure it. Retails for about $5,000, has a 28mm dome tweeter, a 3-inch mid-range dome driver, and then a 12-inch woofer. These speakers look the part, but do they sound the part? Let's talk about it. But before we do that, let's get some specs out of the way and I'll show you some video of the speakers. These retail for about $5,000. They are a three-way design. Rated sensitivity is about 89 decibels, which checks out with my measurements. Nominal impedance is 4 ohm. Minimum impedance is 3.2 ohm. Crossover frequency, since this is a three-way design, 450 hertz for the mid-bass mid-range and 3.5 kilohertz for the mid-range tweeter. The stated power handling is 200 watts, but they say you can go anywhere from about 30 to 50 watts initially. Dimensions are 710 by 420 by 355 millimeters, and that's height, width, depth. That equates to about 28 inches tall, 16.5 inches wide, and 14 inches deep. Weight is 33 kilograms or about 73 pounds. In my opinion, just the looks of these speakers, they look pretty awesome, right? Like, the 12-inch mid-bass or woofer driver on these looks pretty astounding. And then you've got the 3-inch mid-range dome that also looks pretty intimidating. And the tweeter, it looks like a tweeter. What am I going to say? But the speaker as a whole with the walnut finish, it just looks really cool. And matter of fact, somebody on the Steve Hoffman forums reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in testing them. I don't believe that I'd come across the brand until then. So I did reach out to the brand. I asked them if they would be willing to send me a pair to review, and they did. Now, that was a few months ago. I got to apologize to the owners of the brand. I'm running behind, but as they know, I've run into a lot of issues along the way, but I'm finally getting there. I'm just going to be honest and upfront this review, as I always am. So, despite the on-axis response looking kind of crazy, let's just say it looks kind of crazy. When I listen to these speakers, which I always do before I measure, there were a couple things that I noticed, but none of them were exaggerated as what you're going to see in the on-axis response. But they do line up with the estimated in-room response and a bit of a combination with the on-axis response. And this is what the data, in my opinion at least, is always in service to. It's in service to the listening. Now, I don't have the opportunity to really do true blind listening comparisons. I mean, I always know what I'm listening to because I'm the only one setting them up. As far as speakers go. With electronics, that's a little bit different, but that's a different video. So with that said, there are times where I kind of have an expectation of what I'm going to hear, and that is cited bias. But a lot of times what I will do is I will listen to speakers and I won't watch a review, read a review. I won't look for any tech specs before I listen to them because I don't want to be encouraged or discouraged by any previous reviews or measurements from anybody else. So with that said, here are the things that I noticed about these speakers that I liked. So we're going to start with the pros. At lower volume, and I would say below 75 to 80 decibels at about 10 feet away, there's a nice mid-bass thump at lower volumes, right? Not lower volumes, that may be mid volumes to most of you. And it could be high volume to some of you. But there's just a nice, really consistent mid-bass thump. As I turned the volume up, what I noticed was that mid-bass thump tended to overshadow the lower mid-range detail. And I need to note, showing you this graphic, when I talk about distance from the wall, this is what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about the back of the speaker to the wall. Now, when I noticed this issue, it was initially exaggerated when I had the speakers close to the wall in ported configuration because you can stuff the ports. There's 2 ports on the back. You can stuff those ports, and they come with little port bungs. You guys know how I feel about that term, that you can use to stuff those ports. So when ported mode was used and pushed maybe about a foot off that back wall, that bass was too exaggerated. So I had to pull the speakers out from the wall about 2 to 3 feet. And I would recommend if you're going to listen to these in ported configuration, that you do so at least 2 feet, if not 3 feet, ideally, off that back wall. The other thing that I liked about these speakers is that you can push them hard and you don't hear any port chuffing, and you don't hear any excursion issues from the woofer. With smaller speakers, you're going to often run into one of those two things, if not both of those things, and at higher volumes. And the overall tonality in room is pretty nice. Like, there was really not much that stood out to me in my listening sessions, other than that bass bump that I talked about. And then we'll flip this over to the cons a little bit. At the higher frequencies, there were certain times where I would notice a strong glare or shoutiness. And I really don't know how else to put it into words, but you're going to see it in the data shortly. And I think that's going to give you a good idea. But I think I might be able to do something a little bit extra. When I was listening to specifically John Mayer's Split Screen Sadness off of, what was it, Heavier Things album, I believe. What I noticed when I started listening to that song, I don't know if it's like a finger snap, but it's like a finger snap-ish kind of sound. And it sounded a little bit exaggerated to me. So then what did I do is I went and grabbed my headphones and I listened on my headphones. So with that said, when I was listening to those alternate sources, the headphones, I didn't notice that exaggeration as much. So I wrote that down on my notes. And then sure enough, when I look at the data, there's a clear explanation for that. We'll talk about that shortly. But what I want to do is I want to give you a quick example, and maybe that'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Without this exaggeration, I hate to use the word dull because it makes it sound like it's a bad thing, but the neutral, natural response of that song is somewhat dull with that particular snap. With these speakers, it sounds a little bit exaggerated. Now, some of you may like that. And in some cases, maybe that's a good thing. Like in my case, when I was listening to this song initially, it stood out because it stood out as different, but it wasn't bad. And there were a couple other tracks that were similar like that, you know, where I would be listening and I would think, now I don't recall it being quite that elevated or quite that different. You know, there's a different sound, but it wasn't bad. There were, however, other cases where it was a distraction. I didn't necessarily care for that. And again, the data is going to explain that pretty clearly. Another thing about these speakers that didn't seem to quite do as well as other speakers I'm used to listening to, especially ones with better control directivity, is the imaging precision. So imaging is like placement of objects in the soundstage. So if you've got a piano dead center, or you've got a singer to the right of center, or you've got a saxophone out to the left and back in the soundstage, imaging would be your ability to define where those things are in the soundstage. And they're mapped in the music, and it will, of course, vary with the songs you're listening to. You know, an engineer is going to say, I want this sound over here, and another one's going to say, I might want it over here. So even remasters of different albums can sound different for that reason alone, if not for other things, not EQ wise. So with that said, what I noticed was that the imaging with these particular speakers wasn't as tightly focused. So when I would hear an instrument, it would sound like it's somewhere over in this area, but it was a little bit fuzzy. Whereas with more controlled directivity type designs, maybe a waveguided design or a coaxial design from somebody who actually knows what they're doing, like Kef or Genelec, maybe even MoFi. Those designs have more precise imaging of those instruments. So they're like, it's right there. There's no mistake. It's about that big around in my soundstage from this playback system. These speakers, the Revival Atalante 5s, didn't seem to have that same precision. And that also will show up in the measurements. At least my rationale for why it will show up will be in the measurements as well. So let's talk about recommended use. Now, as I said earlier, these can be configured in ported mode or sealed mode just by stuffing the ports. You can also set these up on the stands, or you can set them on the ground. And at the bottom of the speaker, there's a little attachment like a bar, a piece of wood that you can screw in, and it will allow you to tilt the speaker up when it's set on the ground to point directly at you. I found that setting them on the stands worked best for me. As far as ported versus sealed goes, if you choose to use sealed, you can put them about a foot off the back wall. I think you'd be okay, so that's about 1/3 of a meter. If you're going to go full ported mode, at least 2 feet or 0.6 meters off that back wall is what I would recommend. And if you can, get at least a full meter off that back wall, because these guys are going to need some room to breathe. As far as aiming goes, I found that aiming them directly on axis exaggerated that upper treble region a little bit too much. So if I tow them slightly off axis, just a little bit by like 5 to 10 degrees, that worked the best. And for those of you who aren't familiar with my term for on versus off axis, here you go. In black is directly on axis, directly facing the listener. In red, it would be off axis. And in this example, it's 30 degrees. So you're pointed directly out into the room. So if I say 10 degrees off axis, I'm talking somewhere between the black and the red line. As far as the setup of these go, you'll notice that there's an asymmetric layout of the speaker. The tweeter is off to the side of the middle. And that's done to combat diffraction. Some people may say that that's a dumb design, and some people may say that it's a wonderful design. It really does depend on who you talk to. I can make the case for either one, but that's again a separate video. For now, what I'm going to just tell you is that these speakers are labeled left and right, and you can set them up left and right. Although the manual does say that if they're going to be a certain distance apart, and I think it's closer than some value, I can't remember the value now, then you may want to switch them around. And you can play around with that and see what you think. Now, I got to be honest, when I did that, I didn't really notice a big difference. I mean, anything that I might have noticed as a difference, I'm not even sure that I wasn't just making it up in my head, because our brains are so powerful, it can trick us into hearing anything that we want to hear. And if we were to somehow be able to ABX and blind listen test these kind of things, we'd find that we're just full of shit. Like we just are. So that's how it goes, right? With all of that said, let's talk about the data. And I will explain to you in the best way that I possibly can how what I heard in my room relates to the objective anechoic data. All the data that you're about to see is captured using my Klippel near-field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art robotic device that allows me to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic environment. That allows me to see exactly what the speaker is doing, not the speaker in the room, because as a reviewer, it's my job to relay to you as best I possibly can what the speaker is doing and what you can expect when you put it in your room. If I base everything off of what I heard in my room, then that's my room and my positioning. And if you don't do the exact same thing that I did, you're not likely going to hear the same sound that I did. But this is why we have data, and this is why I encourage so many of you to take the time to understand the data. And when it's time to go buy a speaker, look at a few different speakers, look at some of their data that I provide or anybody else provides, make a decision, boil it down to about 2 or 3, then buy those if you can, and then figure out which ones you like in your room and send the other ones back. That's what I would recommend, especially if you're trying to choose a speaker for life. Make sure that you get it right. Don't just go off of one person's opinion. Minimum impedance of about 3.3 ohm. On-axis response sensitivity is about 88.6 decibels. The linearity of this response is kind of all over the place. It's about plus or minus, well, I'm saying almost 5 decibels plus, and that's because of this guy right here. Now, I did see other measurements from another outlet that showed the same thing, although their data is more smooth, so it looks like it kind of chops off like right through here instead of going up here another decibel. And that's why this looks so extreme, is because I have such fine resolution. Now, can you hear that extreme of a cue? Yeah, I think you can, and I think I did in some of my listening. So that's particularly why I was saying that some music sounded a bit different in a bad way, whereas some songs sounded different in a good way. And it really kind of just depends on the song. This bump right here, combined with this dip, is where I talk about at lower volume levels, I like that extra bass emphasis, that punch, which is around a 50 to 60 hertz region, right in that ballpark. If we look at the bass, F3 of 42 hertz, F10 of 30 hertz. These speakers get pretty low. CEA 2034 data set, this area of nonlinearity right here is either due to diffraction or it's due to the vertical displacement of the mid-range to the tweeter. This is the estimated in-room response. And remember, this speaker is not symmetrical, so the tweeter's off to the side. So that's why I have a minus 30 in red and a plus 30 in blue. So I'm going to either side of that tweeter axis. And this is how I heard the speaker in the room. In-room extension to about 40 hertz. Nice, strong, lower mid-bass, upper sub-bass area, but it doesn't quite do, it's not going to do 20 hertz. And it kind of does 30 hertz, but not with a lot of authority. I would say for most music, you're probably going to be safe with these and not have to have a subwoofer. And I imagine that if you're going after these, you're probably of the mindset that you don't want to add a subwoofer. That's just my inclination to believe. If I'm wrong, hey, that's fine. Subwoofers are always a great option, especially for speakers to be able to take the load off of them and also distribute the lower bass modes. But again, that's a separate video too. This lower mid-range dip can cause that lower mid-bass punch to stand out at lower volumes. Like I said a minute ago, at higher volumes, that lower mid-bass punch, that's going to start overriding the detail of the mid-range that's kind of drooped down right through here. The 4K hertz strong on-axis peak subsides. You see that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5K. See how this is kind of subsided? And if I go back up, see how strong this is? It's like 2 to 3 decibels higher, right, than the rest of the on-axis response. So it kind of smoothed out. And that's why I say in room, these speakers sound fine. But when I looked at the measurements, I was like, yo, that's kind of wild when I looked at just the on-axis measurements. And some people will argue with me, and that's fine. This is why this is my channel and this is my opinion. I personally put more emphasis on the estimated in-room response, at least for standard rooms where they're reflective. or maybe a little bit smaller. You know, if you don't have side walls, like you've got a huge room and you don't have side walls that would cause reflection, then the on-axis response is really what you need to be paying attention to. But if you have side walls where there's going to be reflections bouncing off those side walls and coming back to you, or if you have a typical room, I would say that the estimated in-room response is really what you need to be paying attention to. And in my experience, that's what my ears hear the majority of the time. I don't know that there's been a case where I've listened to a speaker and not looked at the estimated in-room response and thought, that's pretty much exactly what I heard. And I've been doing RTA in-room measurement and car measurement with microphones and multi-microphone arrays and all that stuff. Well over 15 years at this point. So I've got a lot of experience here. And I just want to say that so I can preface that it's all with my opinion in tow. If you disagree, that's fine. But I've got a lot of experience in this realm. That's where I'm coming from. This is the horizontal contour plot. And normally I'll put like a plus minus range, but this fluctuates, right? So I could have said it's at 60 degrees, but then down here it's at 40 degrees. And then back up here, it's around 60 degrees again. So maybe I could say on average, it's around 60 degrees plus or minus. But I just wanted to call out that it does kind of dip in this region right here, which is about where that mid-range tweeter crossover is. The vertical response, make sure you're on that tweeter axis because you really don't have a lot of leeway there. Harmonic distortion at 86 decibels and at 96 decibels. Multi-tone distortion looks good to me. Yeah, it's below about 1% almost all the way through up into the high frequency where it does ramp up. And then if I look at compression or dynamic range of the speaker capability, it also looks really quite good to me, except for the ultra higher frequency area where there is more compression. Is it an issue? Well, as high in the frequency range as it is, honestly, I don't think so, given that music content rarely goes up this high, but it's worth noting just like all the other data for you to make comparisons for. And that does it for this review. I'll just sum it up really quickly. I honestly really like these speakers. I like the look of them. I like the mid-bass impact. I like the overall tonality of them. Does it have its issues? Yeah, it's got a couple of them that I mentioned already. At higher volume, that mid-bass bump, that lower mid-bass bump, tends to override the mid-range detail because there's a little bit of a dip in that mid-range to mid-bass region, right? Between like 100 to 300 hertz. There's also that bump on axis at 4K hertz. So if you toe these speakers out just a little bit, you'll alleviate that down some and you'll get more benefit by having a speaker that sounds more neutral in room. And this is why I always take the time to listen before I measure, because the whole purpose of all this stuff is really for me to relay to you my thoughts and opinions about what I heard by using objective data. And you can use that objective data on your own when it comes time for you to make comparisons for what you want to buy. And I hope you all understand why it's important to have that data and that it's not completely useless. We can make a lot of sense out of the data, but you can't have just one graphic that shows on-axis response. You need a whole bunch of data to really tell a story. Just like in the example where I showed you the on-axis response showing a peak around 4K, but the estimated in-room response shows a more linear, smooth response. And that's closer to what I heard than the direct sound. And that also gives me an idea of, hey, how should I orient the speaker? Same thing for the bass. If I wanted to use these speakers real close to a wall, the bass response would tell me, probably not a good idea unless you seal the cabinet, so you might want to bring them out. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to support this channel, that would be awesome. You can do so one of a couple ways. You can join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner, and there I give behind the scenes information. I do polls, I ask my audience different questions, and you also get early access to these videos and some early access to the data as well as my thoughts on certain things that I may not publish publicly. Gosh, that was really hard to say. Alternatively, if you'd like to use any of my generic affiliate links in the description box below, Crutchfield, Amazon, Best Buy, Audio Advice, etc., please feel free to use those. Those do earn me a small commission at no additional cost to you, but it's a great way to support the channel when you have to go buy something anyway. If you want to kick over a few bucks in my direction by doing that, using that affiliate link, that would be great and greatly appreciated. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.